Timothy was awakened by the ringing of his smartphone. He struggled to open his eyes and tried to find his phone and turn it off. But instead, he accepted the call and immediately heard his friend's cheerful voice. "Are you okay there?" asked Paul and chuckled. "Paul, are you kidding me?" groaned Timothy. "Why did you wake me up? My head is splitting after last night. When your mother finds out what you did yesterday, your head won't stop hurting because she'll chop it off." Timothy had little recollection of the details of last night, and Paul told his buddy what had happened at the restaurant. As it turned out, after getting angry at some pretty girl's refusal, Timothy started a fight, destroyed half the bar, and beat up the bartender. Paul tried to stop Timothy, but he was just not himself, and now he had to compensate for the significant damage. Timothy clutched his head, realizing what he had done, and worst of all, his mother would soon find out about it and lecture him again. And indeed, as soon as he finished talking to his friend, Mrs. Morris burst into the room and began to reprimand her son. "Timothy, how can you behave so irresponsibly? Some people called me and demanded compensation for damages. Have you completely lost your mind? Look what you've become like. It's a good thing your father hasn't lived to see what his beloved son, the heir of the dynasty, has become." As Timothy glimpsed in the mirror hanging on the wall and involuntarily shuddered. An unshaven, rumpled young man of about 26 with red, inflamed eyes was looking at him. "Mom, I'm sorry. I promise I won't do it again." "Stop it, Timothy. You've already promised many times and never kept your word," indignantly exclaimed Mrs. Morris. Mother has long ranted, moralizing, and finally said that her son should get married and start a family, and if he could not do it for himself, then she would solve the problem. As it turned out, Mrs. Morris had already had in mind a girl from a good family whom Timothy should marry. Her name is Sophia, and I invited her and her parents to join us for dinner tonight. So kind, clean yourself up before 7 o'clock tonight, and don't you dare be late or play any tricks. In an hour after that, you'll be kicked out of the house as a pauper. Do you understand me? This is the last warning." And Mrs. Morris looked menacingly at her son. "Okay, I got it, Mom." Timothy nodded, thinking with relief that this difficult conversation was over. But as soon as evening came, the despondency returned to him again. That the supposed bride turned out to be a tall, thin girl with glasses, and Timothy didn't like her at all. He could not imagine her near him, not only in bed but also in everyday life. When his parents left them alone, the man confessed to Sophia that he was not ready to marry her, and he was sure that she was not ready for that either. "Yes, Timothy, you're right, especially since I'm already in love with another man. But I can't tell my parents about him as he is very poor, and they will hardly accept him. Nevertheless, I'll be together with him anyway. As a last resort, I'll just leave home, and you're ready to become a poor woman. Box 2 as Kim, a poor woman. It doesn't matter. At least I'll be with my beloved," Sophia replied, looking seriously at Timothy. Timothy was surprised, but thought about it a little. Of course, he did not have a beloved girl yet, but she could appear at any moment. The Pachin, as parting, they agreed with Sophia that they would both refuse the marriage imposed by their parents. When the guests parted, Mrs. Morris immediately had a conversation with her son about marriage, but Timothy cheerfully told her that there was no way he and Sophia could get married because she had a groom and he had a bride. "You're lying to me again." The mother was angry with Timothy again. "Well, look, if you don't introduce her to me in the next week, trust me, you'll go straight to work as a longshoreman in our warehouse. Maybe then you'll learn to value money and respect your mother." To get away from his disgruntled mother's eyes for a while, Timothy drove out to the countryside for a few days, where he stayed in Paul's grandmother's old country house. One day, he decided to go for a walk. He wandered for a long time through the woods, down to the lake, and finally climbed a hill, which gave him a picturesque view of the surrounding countryside. Suddenly, a huge wolf came towards him. Timothy froze with fright and was afraid to move, but suddenly an unbelievable vision appeared before him. Of senses, a fragile, beautiful red-haired girl in a white sundress. She stepped to the wolf and stroked his head, whispering something in his ear, and he obediently laid down at her feet. Timothy could not believe his eyes. "Don't be afraid. His name is Gray. He won't hurt you when you are with me." And the girl spoke. "Who are you?" asked Timothy. "Are you real or a figment of my imagination?" The girl laughed and told him that her name was Shelley, and she lived in the village, and Gray was not a wolf at all, but a cross between a wolf and a dog. Her grandfather once rescued a wounded wolf, and he stayed to live with them, and then he became Gray's father. "Shelley, what are you doing here?" asked Timothy, who had already regained consciousness. "I'm an artist and I'm painting now. There's my easel. Let me show you." And seeing that Timothy looked at Gray, she added, "Don't be afraid. He won't hurt you. He's gentle." Timothy walked beside the girl and secretly considered her fiery red hair, her thin waist, and her small, porcelain-like hands stained with paint. They came to the old easel left by the girl quickly, and Timothy gasped in surprise. He was amazed at the precision and grace of the painting he was seeing before his eyes now. "It's outstanding," exclaimed Timothy. "You have talent. Where did you study?" "Nowhere. I'm self-taught." Timothy was stunned. He asked if she had many paintings, and the girl sadly replied that so far there were very few, because paints and canvases were expensive and she didn't always have enough money even to live on. For occasions, the young people got talking, and Timothy was unable to part with the red-haired beauty until the evening. In the evening, they said goodbye, and Timothy immediately drove to the city. But the next day, he returned again with some purchases. He was drawn to Shelley like a magnet, and he realized he was truly in love for the first time in his life. He brought her a new easel, paints, canvases, and at first Shelley refused to take them, embarrassedly. But Timothy assured her that it was a gift from the bottom of his heart, and she agreed. Thus, with each passing day, He realized more and more that this was the woman he had been looking for. A week later, Mrs. Morris reminded her son of his promise, and Timothy assured her that tomorrow he would come to dinner with his bride, whose name was Shelley. The mother was surprised but decided to wait until the evening and make sure that he really had found a worthy bride. When Timothy told his beloved about his mother's request, she was confused, but nevertheless she gave in to the persuasion, and the very next evening she met his mother. Mrs. Morris looked at the poorly dressed, red-haired young woman with bewilderment and invited her guest and her son to the table with an unhappy expression on her face. At dinner, Mrs. Morris began an interrogation. She wondered where the girl worked and, more importantly, who were her parents. "Itations, I work at the local poultry farm. In my spare time, I paint landscapes and portraits. My mom died in childbirth and my dad died when I was 5 years old. He saved a boy from drowning, and when he came ashore with him, his heart gave out. The boy survived, but my dad didn't. I was raised by my grandfather. He worked all his life as a forester, and he passed away recently too." "I see. Well, here's the thing, dear. You must have incredible ambition to choose my son, but I assure you Timothy is not seriously interested in a simple country girl like you. I understand that you are tired of life in the village and want to move to the city, but please don't do it at the expense of my son." "Mother, how can you say that?" resented Timothy. "I'm a mother, and I can say whatever I think is right. I care about you, and I want my grandchildren to have a good heredity. Then wait for grandchildren from another son because I'm leaving. Let's go." "Shelley," Timothy stated firmly, standing up and taking Shelley's hand. He led her to the exit. "Is Timothy?" shouted his mother. "Did Timothy come back? You won't get a cent. You'll come crawling back to apologize." But the son didn't listen to her threat and left the house. He never planned to return to again. A tolling year passed. Timothy and Shelley got married and settled in her village home. The man worked in the village and earned money for his family, while Shelley stayed at home with their little son, who had just turned 1 month old. Timothy's mother knew all about them, but her pride prevented her from forgiving her son. But one morning, she woke up and realized that her life had lost all meaning, and then she decided to make peace with him. Timothy was at work, and Shelley was tending to the household when an expensive car drove up. To the house and Mrs. Morris got out. Shelley came out to meet her and invited her into the house. Mrs. Morris said a dry hello, got up on the porch but stopped when she found out that Timothy was not at home. The woman decided to wait for him in the car and turned to leave, but suddenly she stumbled and fell on the steps, screaming in pain and fright. Shelley rushed to her, helped her up and took her inside. Mrs. Morris was moaning in pain, holding her arm, and Shelley, examining the bruised area, knew at once that she had a shoulder dislocation. "Call a doctor immediately," shouted Mrs. Morris, squirming in pain. "Why, it's not difficult," Shelley said calmly, and with a swift movement, she set it back. Mrs. Morris cried out in pain but was immediately relieved. She was impressed by her daughter-in-law's skill and asked her how she knew all this. Shelley explained that her grandfather was not only a forester but also a healer, and she had learned a lot from him. She pulled out some herbs and made a herbal tea. "Drink this and you'll feel much better," she said, holding out the mug to her guest with a smile, "and then we'll have dinner." Timothy returned home a couple of hours later and was taken aback when he recognized his mother's car. But to his surprise, he found the two women chatting nicely. Mrs. Morris was holding her grandson in her arms. When she noticed her son, she smiled and said, "Son, I'm happy for you. You are very lucky. I was very wrong, and I could hardly have found a better wife for you than Shelley. Forgive me, please, any rude words and actions.